Hi, I'm Luke. Welcome to DB Clips. Today I want to look at the question, how does God change our life? In Matthew 13, Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, and how a man who found it sells everything that he has to obtain that treasure. Today we're going to look at Colossians 1, verses 21 through 23. This kind of gives us a high-level view of God's ultimate plan for our salvation and restoration to Him. Let's break this down, starting with verse 21. Verse 21 says, "And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds." In man's rebellion against God, we were separated from Him, and all of creation was cursed. It's why some people ask the question, if God is so loving, why is everything so terrible? And the answer is sin. When sin entered the world, everything that was good was essentially turned on its head. In John 8:34, Jesus says everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. And Paul also describes us as slaves to sin in Romans 6:20. In our fallen state, we were alienated from God and slaves to sin, so much so that this verse describes us as hostile to God. Now, this was not God's plan for His creation, and He loved us too much to allow us to stay that way. In verse 22, it says, "He is now reconciled in His body of flesh by His death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before Him." We see God's loving nature and how He responded to us being separated with no way in ourselves to restore or bridge the gap between us and Him. If God is truly loving, then He must hate sin. And if God is truly just, then there must be a price paid for that sin. So how does He reconcile these two opposing characteristics when it comes to us? He did it by paying that price Himself, a cost so high we can't, nor would we ever have been able to pay it. Paying that price, Jesus presents us to the Father holy and blameless. He bridges the gap and brings us back to God's presence. Paul describes this as a legal act of God adopting us into His family. Our previous lives and deeds are no longer who we are, and we're now children of God. When this happens in your life, you understand the example that Jesus gave, this treasure so valuable that you would give up everything to have it. Charles Spurgeon said it this way: "You will generally notice that when the believer gets near to God, tastes the unseen joys, and eats the bread that was made in heaven, all the feasts of the earth, all its amusements, and all its glories seem very flat, stale, and unprofitable." It's then this treasure we have found that drives us to live our lives differently. There's no more earning or achieving because it's been done for us. And this is what we call justification. We're now justified in the sight of God. And this isn't the end, though. God is restoring all of His creation when we're a part of that. Sanctification is what happens after salvation, and it's the process of God restoring us to who He called us to be, namely, to be like Him. Verse 23a says, "If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard." God has brought us salvation, but it will be in our continued presence with Him that we're able to change our life. This is not simply behavior modification, though. That only works as long as the reward for good behavior outweighs the reward for bad. This is a process of us coming to know more of God through His Word and in prayer. As we grow to know God better, our desire for the rewards of sin and sin itself lessens as we desire God more. We're not robots, though, and God doesn't simply control our actions. This is an intentional action on our part. And if we fail to spend time with God, the problems of the world come in, and it will rob us of that joy we found in salvation. When we persevere in our faith, though, we see the results of that. And in the second half of verse 23, it says, "Which has been proclaimed in all of creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister." When we have tasted the love of God and salvation, we will run to proclaim it. And Paul is an excellent example of this life change that happens. He started out persecuting the church and even putting people to death for their faith. But when he found salvation, he gave up everything to proclaim the good news of the gospel. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, go to our website, dbcc.com, click on Grow and then Sermons, look for the teaching series on Colossians, and click on the sermon titled Too Good to Be True. Thanks, and God bless.